let's see here. I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay. I put together a few slides. So Ron, we'll give you a bit of background and some other folks who aren't familiar with Solid and what it's all about. So can you see my screen, Ron?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think of these things in terms of decentralization, and the architecture is decentralized in the sense that the whole purpose of Solid is to help users protect and control their own data. So the Solid ecosystem is one example of that. You can sign up and get a Solid pod to store your data in. You can create apps that use the Solid pods, and governments are working on doing data management and GDPR compliance with the help of this kind of decentralized architecture. So that's one form of decentralization that's out there. Another form that's related is so-called DWeb or decentralized web. And some of these schemes use what's called the interplanetary file system, IPFS. It's akin to BitTorrent and how it works, sort of a peer-to-peer architecture. And there are startups who are developing decentralized apps with the help of that kind of approach. And public blockchains in some way might be considered decentralized, but as we know, Bitcoin is really managed by a close cadre of people and the people that are able to mine the Bitcoin. So is it truly decentralized? We could talk about that. And then a fourth option, Flurry has a decentralized option. It's a kind of a hybrid RDF store and blockchain. So those are some of the examples of decentralization, moving toward a peer-to-peer architecture. And in particular, the Solid project is focused on the storage of the data. And so Ruben Vorborg uses this diagram to describe it. You can see how these personal or institutional data pods are sort of queried individually, and you have access control that the person or the institution provides to allow use of that data. And so it really is consistent with the data-centric architecture that Semantic Arts has advanced. Here's a comparison of how the centralized web apps work. You know, you've got a silo, a Facebook silo, you've got a LinkedIn silo, a Doodle silo, and they're all controlled by the people who run the applications environments, versus the Solid approach, which utilizes the data that is granted access to by the individuals or the institutions themselves. And so, Ron, with this approach, obviously, if you get it together, you can avoid data duplication. There's data reuse that's possible, and GDPR compliance, personal data protection compliance in general is a lot more straightforward and powerful. So what's the problem? What's the obstacle to decentralization? Well, of course, it's incumbents. We've got, this is a chart that I updated that looks at the global market cap leaders in the world. It's as of 31 March 2021. And Apple's at the top with over 2 trillion in market cap. You'll see many of the other tech giants, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Tencent, and Alibaba on that list. They're all major collectors of data, obviously, personal data, obviously. And really that has something to do with how they manage to have the huge market caps that they have. And they're all, the ones that I mentioned are all users of knowledge graphs. They've all got their own knowledge graphs, either with their assistants or with their product graphs, or in the case of Facebook, with their user graph. Amazon's got a product graph, and it uses knowledge graph technology in Alexa, and Apple's been using Siri, which is knowledge graph based, or has been historically. So these are the folks that want to keep centralization in place, and that's a big obstacle to overcome. So I just thought we could have a quick discussion of the different aspects of decentralization, so-called.
Did you want to discuss, or Larry, what was the topic of today's call?
Yeah, we can. Larry, you want to? I've got some notes here. I can sort of scroll through as you're talking about the takeaways that you had.
Yeah, we probably have similar notes. Basically, it was kind of a smorgasbord. They had first Ruben talked about verifiable credentials, and it's like it's a W3C standard, I believe, that provides consent for data reuse. It's like the mechanism by which, like that second diagram of Ruben's that you showed, Alan, that would be the mechanism for the release of of your contacts, your calendar, your other info up to those. And then Oz gave a quick update on and Inrupt is like, I'm not sure the exact relationship, but Inrupt is like a service provider affiliated with the Solid project. And Oz gave a guy named Oz Olivo gave just a quick update on their research and planning for version 1.2. They just launched 1.1 in April. And then I think the sort of the centerpiece of the meeting was an attorney named Elliot Bihar talked about privacy and the kind of the legal perspective, and a lot of especially the benefits of Solid as not just exceeding, but in most cases, not just meeting, but in most cases exceeding like GDPR and other legal requirements. And then Greg and Anton gave a demo. They both work for the Swedish government, and they gave a demo of like a system there that shows kind of an implementation of Solid, and showed it from both the user perspective and the enterprise perspective, which was really interesting to see how the example they used was someone seeking a job, and how the job seeker, their controls over their information that they would share, the employer's view of prospective candidates. And then right at the very end, he showed, which it seemed to be the highlight of the demo, was the job candidate then revoking the privilege after their job search. So anyway, that's a quick overview of, and I think that's pretty typical of the Solid World events I've been to, is sort of a they'll just do multiple presentations like that, and they did that all in an hour. It was a very well-run meeting, I gotta say.
Yeah, and Tim Berners-Lee also mentioned, Larry, I don't know if I heard this right, that Flanders in Belgium is going to be creating solid pods for the citizenry. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sorry, I totally missed the most important guy at the meeting. Yeah, Tim talked about that at the very start, and yeah, that's something that Ruben had talked about on that call. I do too many of these calls. I can't remember which call it was last week, where Ruben had talked, had kind of previewed that announcement that the Flemish part of Belgium is I don't know exactly how it's going to work, but yeah, every citizen there will have their own pod, and I'm not sure exactly the implementation, but it's it's a group effort, and Solid is the foundation of it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So Larry, I'll stop sharing if I can figure out how to do that here. Yeah. So Larry, is it your impression that there's been a lot of progress over the past 3 years with Solid? You've been to a number of these events. Peter also has a point of view on this, I'm sure.
Yeah, I can't speak with any real authority on it. I've been sort of a hanger on dabbler. I'm not super technical, but I've been to like many meetings over the past several years, and yeah, it's definitely. I mean, a lot of the stuff that was just theoretical 3 years ago is there are things happening now, like Inrupt and actual software and actual implement. Like the Flemish government. That's huge, I think. That'll be a great test of how this stuff actually works. But yeah, I would defer to others on authoritative presentations about it.
It strikes me that one of the big challenges that Tim Berners-Lee and his group face is that they're taking a top-down approach to this, where they're working closely with the EU governments on getting this together, and that's not a bad thing. But in terms of the alternatives to Solid, it seems like those are more grassroots oriented. So the DWeb, so-called, there's just a lot of open source activity around that, and a lot of interest in that because of the autonomy that it promises.
So Peter's got his hand up.
Peter?
Hi. So the work that has been going on in Flanders has been, they were beginning to do some pilots probably right at the very early days, and we in Semantic Arts have had Ralph Buell come give us a Friday talk about all the stuff that they're doing. So not only do they bring in the solid pod stuff, but they also have a pretty comprehensive IRI-based information architecture that has been recently adopted not just by the Flemish government in Flanders, but also by the Brussels government and Wallonia. So it's right the way through the whole of Belgium. But the other thing about it is that the architecture that we need to be getting away from is from the use of third parties to provide authentication and authorization. And the DIDs and the self-sovereign identity work that's been ongoing within W3C is that other key part to it. So as well as solid pods, what you have is then them containing your authorization, your credentials, and different sorts of things like that. And that can then be privacy protecting in different ways. Not only do you control access, but also these sort of things can be used to give validation, not by releasing your data, but just giving a kind of yes, no, are you over 21, for example? You don't need to be given your birth date, but the information can be authoritatively validated in this sort of way. And so I think that this is another of the technologies that, together with the distributed architecture of the personal knowledge graphs in solid pods, is going to make it quite a bit more challenging for organizations that have hitherto really relied upon a membership basis of people using them for a range of different services, not only what they provide directly, but also the authorization approach. And it means that anybody developing systems is going to have to be thinking outside of the box when it comes to their own approaches to authentication, authorization beyond OAuth 2 and what have you.
Well, you've touched on something that's really important when it comes to the DIDs and verifiable credentials. And if you think about the data breaches that keep increasing in number and amount of data compromised, one of the things that's been behind, one of the reasons that thieves have been focused on these large repositories is because they have so much personally identifiable information and they could just grab it in one place. Whereas if it's all decentralized and encrypted and it's just used for validation as you described, then a large incentive for the data breach goes away.
Hey, do any of you guys know, is there a shared model, data model for Solid? In other words, how do people interrogate it? I mean,
I don't know any.
I saw in that picture you could query it. I'm thinking, who, is there a model? How would you query it?
That's something I don't know about yet, Dave. Yeah, you've got this reusable query engine library, and I don't know how that approach works. Does anybody on the call?
So I think a lot of stuff is based around JSON-LD, and so you've got things like, what is it, LD Flex and other things like that in that ecosystem.
But that's just mechanism. If everybody decides to have a different data model in their pod, then nobody's going to be able to query across a bunch of pods.
So within the Flemish situation, there what you've got are national data architectures and core vocabularies based. So the thing within the EC is that they have a range of core vocabularies, which are these sort of top level mini ontologies for different entity classes. And those will be used by government organizations and what have you for all the national stuff. I mean, this is what we were hearing about from Norway also, who has implemented a similar sort of thing. This is going to be very widespread as more and more EU countries get bringing products to the fore. They're all based on this sort of thing.
And I think Dave Rubin during the call mentioned that there was a question from Peter Campbell about the digital rights language that's a standard, and Rubin's answer to Peter was, is this language involved with Solid was the question. The answer was, well, it could be a candidate, and so we're looking at all sorts of vocabularies that could be included. And that one is a definite candidate because it's already a W3C standard. So, I think they'll be advancing the various standard vocabularies as a part of what they're doing with these governments, Dave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the lawyer was really talking a lot about how much more compliance you could get with a Solid approach, and of course that's another key benefit from an organizational perspective. But
yeah, we have another hand from another Ruben.
Another Ruben.
Yep.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
I am Flemish and I live in Brussels, so I've been following the conversation today and some of the other sessions before, and I'm actually involved in a project or in an NGO called My Data. They are Finnish based and originate from Finland, Helsinki. But they are actually doing a lot of work on the topics of self-sovereign identity, and just the My Data model itself has an architecture behind it. So they call it the My Data Nordic model, and it's based around data operators, so to say. And in Brussels, together with 2 other people, I'm leading the Brussels hub of My Data, and we are actually collaborating with the Flemish government on the Solid implementation. And we're combining several architectures or several entities that work on the same topic. So there's Solid indeed, but on the European front, you also have Gaia X, which is the European cloud project, which is actually not a cloud project in itself, in the sense that it provides a reference architecture, and it tries to engage private and public players that can set up a cloud according to that architecture. But so I think the essence is that there's a lot of fragmented work that's happening. And on the Belgian front, we are trying to converge some of those efforts. And on the question of, okay, what's the data model behind it, or behind Solid, I think that's tackled in Gaia X. If you look at the architecture behind Gaia X, they are talking about European data spaces, which is part of the European data strategy, saying that, okay, you have the typical verticals of industries, but there should also be cross-sectoral personal data spaces. And so they are tackling that issue now of okay, how can you actually make a more coherent data model that spans across different verticals. So that's a bit of the landscape there. The big 3 players on that front currently in Belgium are Gaia X, which has their official seat in Brussels, My Data, which is closely aligned with the European institutions, and which is funded by Sitra, which is the sovereign wealth fund of Finland, and they have a project called IHAN, which is focusing on personal data, and they have a rule book and an architecture themselves as well. So the way I see it from my perspective is that there's a lot of activity going on, but up until now it's been fragmented. So I think the aim or the ambition of the Flemish government or of the Flemish initiative is to kind of bring together players and introduce a proof of concept or bring together these initiatives into a publicly funded project that can deliver value for citizens. And one of the first or one of the projects that a colleague of mine is working on is what's called a My Mobility profile. So that would be using or utilizing Solid as the underlying technology, and so every citizen would have a My Mobility profile pod, which then is connected to both private and public players, and that is sustained in itself by the MAAS Alliance, which is mobility as a service. So there's a lot of activity going on, and if you have any questions on any of the projects, I would be happy to help out or to introduce.
Wow, that was excellent. What was the one other thing you said? IHAM? How did you spell that?
IHAM, yes.
How do you spell that?
IHAM. So if you go to citra.fi, I'll put it in the
thank you,
in the chat. You will find that they have three main projects. One is sustainability and the circular economy, and then IHAN is actually part of the fair data economy project. So that's where that resides. And yesterday they held a conference on the fair data economy, but I don't think the recording is available online already.
So Ruben, are any of the big commercial players evident in participating in these efforts? I know that Microsoft, for example, has been involved with the decentralized ID standard, and at one point was developing a personal data hub that they had talked about on their blog. That was a few years ago. IBM's also been involved. Are there others that we should know about who are trying to get behind this or help out with it?
If you talk about the really big players, I think all of them are American at this stage. And they have their own project, the Data Transfer Project, which is a sort of platform-centric approach to data sharing. I think if you look at the three architectural models or the three approaches towards data sharing and interoperability, that would be the one that's led by the giants. So because they each have their own speciality, so to say, and so there's not really a competitive threat to being able to move your data or to move your services from one to the other in that sense, and it just substantiates their dominance at the moment. Then you have sovereign, for example, and more fragmented piecemeal approaches towards data sovereignty and self-sovereign identity, DIDs, and all the smaller projects that are in the space. And then there's in Europe, there's another initiative that was incubated in the My Data community, which is called a New Governance. And they are trying to build a sort of third way by indeed building an alliance with companies that are also considered incumbents, but that see the big tech companies as a threat themselves. And so they've gathered 150 signatures of bigger companies in Europe, a lot of German industrial companies as well, Belgian ones as well, and they are trying to form an alliance there. But I think the main challenge there is to overcome the tragedy of the commons or something in that sense, because they all realize that they have to gain in the future by proper data sharing and by collaborating. But I think nobody is really keen on setting that first step and opening up their data towards other companies. So the incentive mechanisms are also something to think about in that sense. But I know in Belgium, Tom Hagemans, one of the speakers today, he was my promoter. I don't know if that's correct in English, but my master's thesis was actually on the impact of the GDPR in terms of information management in companies. And so he was doing his PhD at the University of Leuven at that time, and he guided me. And then after a few years, he raised his own company called Digita, and they are providing software on top of the solid technology as well. And I know that they are working with bigger private players in Belgium at the moment to onboard them, and basically they provide middleware for companies to be able to cater for GDPR rights, because a lot of companies have difficulties in managing and keeping track of data subject rights requests and things like that. And they provide a middleware component to that based on solid technology. So that's where things are currently a bit moving, and where some of the bigger players that are not big tech players are involved, as far as I know.
And Ruben, would you want to expand a little bit more on the data spaces policies?
Sure.
Because I think that impacts on a lot of private companies.
Right. To be honest, I don't have that much authority in speaking about the topic, because it's been a while since I have been in touch with the person that's really.
I think the big picture is that the EU recognizes that a single digital market is really important for national development, and so what they're doing is dividing it up into, I think, about 11 different sectors.
Right.
They're calling them these data spaces, so that they can focus on each one and its needs specifically. And this links in with Industry 4.0 and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's the one, right?
And each one of those is linked in with a citizen's engagement with that industry or that sector through these personal data spaces.
Yeah, that's what they have or indicated in yellow here. But that was added afterwards, actually. So in the
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, in the initial strategy, I think the cross-sectoral personal data space element was not foreseen yet.
Well, I think also you have to take these things in stages and just get people used to one idea at a time.
And as I said, the mobility space or the mobility vertical, that's actually what the slide deck is about. So as I said, My Data Brussels is behind that effort, and that's Paul Thijsken. So he's also a co-founder of the Brussels Hub. So this is a bit of the architectural picture of what the My Mobility profile pod would look like, and then you have a My Data consent operator, which would be the equivalent of what was shown today in the slide deck of Solid, right? Sort of intermediary that keeps track of consent, but in itself that requires a data model or a sort of taxonomy for how to define consent, and that has proven to be a challenge already. If you look at the efforts by the IAB for marketing consent online, but that's in a nutshell, I think, what these efforts are leading to. Yeah, this is the main slide, and then I think here this was a slide deck presented in February. Agoria is it's an organization in Belgium as well, and I think here it was explaining. This is the main architectural picture of Gaia X. But I have to admit I'm not an expert on that as well. But there's a lot of resources to be found on the Gaia X website in that regard. But they initially Gaia X and the I don't know if it's mentioned here. It's called Gaia X is actually the European initiative, but the slide here stems from the International Data Spaces Association, so IDSA. And at some point, IDSA and Gaia X have converged in the sense that IDSA was focusing on mainly German industrial players and providing an industrial data space. So that's why it's called international or industrial data spaces. But now they're opening it up, and they're realizing that the architecture or the reference architecture that they have provided, if it's added with a consent component, that it can also serve as an architecture for this more transversal or trans sectoral data space of personal data.
You know, where Alan started the conversation a little bit, I think, is sort of this question of what is it going to take to get this thing jump started? Because, you know, as we know, the giant tech companies have all this data, and people go along with it because it's convenient, and people want to have their privacy, but they kind of don't want to. They don't want it so badly they would actually work for it. And so at some point, and I don't know if anybody was talking much about what is it going to take, but one of the thoughts that just went through my mind as you're going through this, I mean, we've got this great opportunity right now that would take almost no metadata at all, which is you know, a vaccine passport. One would think that pretty soon people would say, I would like to have a vaccine passport and I would like to be able to control it, and you know, maybe that's a jumpstart use case. I mean, you have to have something to get this thing started.
the vaccine or the health use case in COVID is one
Yeah.
of the projects that my data is pioneering as well. But I'm not sure to what extent the European vaccine passport will actually be inspired on that architecture. But indeed, it's forced. It's a forced collaboration in that sense.
Yeah.
And it could serve as a good proof of concept if it works out, and if the players that can provide the solutions can provide them in time,
Right.
and get the right credit for it. I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
But apart
Dave,
from
and-
that, sorry.
No, I'll just say another use case that comes up all the time is every time there's a data breach. I think we should be bringing this up.
But unfortunately, the onus on that one is on the companies, not the individuals. The vaccine one is very personal. The data breach, you hate it when they leak your data all over the place, but the companies, their response typically is not, gee, let's just give all that data back to the people. It's typically, we better button it down better. We did a terrible job. Let's close up the rest of those, API breach holes. So, I'm not convinced. Well, maybe it's possible, but man, that's going to be a hard sell, I think. I think it's going to have to be bottom up.
So I think it's going to be a mixture because of the fines that are associated with GDPR. I mean, they're very, very severe.
Yes,
but let's
and
say
no.
you find somebody $1 billion. Their response is they have three responses. One, pay the $1 billion. That's what Google does. Two is, gee, let's prevent the next $1 billion by patching up all the potential holes in our architecture. And a distant C is, let's get rid of all this toxic data, give it back to our users, and have a federated query when we need it. I mean, man, I don't know. That's a tough sell.
Is exchange of data between patients and providers becomes a good use case then?
Yeah, I think that's one of the best ones.
Yeah.
And a couple of years ago when this was coming up, I said, in fact, I guess it was still vaccines. It was when, either to travel or to send your kids to school, you have to have proof of immunization. And it's always a hassle because it's in your medical record somewhere, but you can't get it and you have to fax it to you. I mean, good God. And so this world's simplest app, just give me my kid's immunization record. And now, of course, COVID makes it that much more urgent. I want to go to a rock and roll concert and I can't go unless I show up with a green QR code. That should be the starting point.
I'm thinking even more. Say, for example, you have a situation where that immunization record needs to go to multiple different parties, right? Schools need it, and other babysitting kind of places would need it, and so these various types of providers identify the different types of providers that would interact with that my data, and understand how do you objectify that data elements in a way that data can be shared with some kind of a mask identifier, or in a summarized way, and say, do I really need to see when you got vaccinated and what kind of vaccination? If you just, all you need to know is whether this person got immunized for this or not, get an yes or no answer. So I think coming up with what is minimal required information for different parties involved within that, and then packaging that might be a wonderful use case, I'm thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only reason I want to stop short of the entire medical record is because once you go from something simple like immunization to something complicated like your medical record, all of a sudden you have to convince people you have everything that's in Epic, which is 200,000 fields, and now it's like, oh God. You got to start with something that you could solve. And I think immunization and COVID is it.
Yeah, like a digital shot card.
Yeah.
And along the lines of digital IDs, I'm wondering, you know, I just get driven crazy sharing my social security number to every bank that I have
Yep.
to talk to, or
Yep.
any financial institution or healthcare provider. And you're constantly giving the same personally identifiable information over and over again to all of them. And they're duplicating it in so many different places. Is there a way to get governments to prioritize this method versus all the other methods that are just creating noise out there?
Yeah,
But aren't we just a team to do it? I mean, okay, who's going to be doing it? I mean, look at us.
No, I know.
I know we have a client, and they just recently did a profile kind of audit of their internal systems, and they discovered that they had social security numbers, these are US tax IDs, in 8,397 different places in their various systems.
Mhm.
So that's 8,300 things they've got to fix one way or another. Now, saying that we're going to put it in solid is nice, but they now have 8,300 programs to go fix. I mean, they're broken anyway. They need to fix them, but are they immediately going to say, "Oh yeah, I get it now"? Sorry about that.
No, Dave, and I think you can multiply that number by the number of enterprises in the world, and that
Yep,
kind of gets at a big problem. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. But how to get purchase on the solution is the issue.
Well, you mentioned top down and bottom up, Dave, and the bottom up initiatives that I've seen are very much along the lines of what the Ethereum folks call the DAO, the decentralized autonomous organization, and there are startups who are lined up to try to take advantage of that kind of approach. Um, talk about fragmentation. Ruben mentioned fragmentation. Imagine the fragmentation in the blockchain world or IPFS, all that open source, decentralized cloud of stuff that's just out there in the P2P world,
But one of the interesting evolvements, I think, in the blockchain space is the emergence of what's called token engineering. And they actually refer to this dichotomy between bottom up and top down as a false dichotomy, in the sense that token engineering, or if you can incentivize people to work towards a common good and actually benefit from it themselves, or do it out of self-interest, that's how you can actually bridge that gap, right, between top down enforcement and bottom up innovation, so to say. So I think indeed, and maybe that's a bit radical in that sense, but the system currently is broken to that extent that I don't think the solution will come from hierarchically or companies that are organized in traditional ways, right? With a hierarchical, top-down, vertical organization, right? It's gonna come from new forms of governance and new forms of organizations, DAOs, as was mentioned, and these organizations will not have leadership in the traditional sense anymore, but they will function nonetheless, and they will function towards a certain goal that's engineered in their constitution, which is then the code. But then indeed it comes back to the initial question: are we currently already in a decentralized paradigm, or is it just old wine in new vases, and it's very central again. If you look at Elon Musk and that kind of situation.
So Chris has his hand up, and then I have a question after Chris's. So go ahead, Chris.
Okay, so thank you, Dave. We talked about putting a social security number into the solid pod. Does that mean, in effect, that the URL of the solid pod will become your kind of master identifier? And if that's the case, who is it, or what authority is it that ties that to you?
Well, on the call, the Solid World call, Chris, there's lots of mentions of Web ID as the access, what's used to request access control, authorization, authentication. As to who's in charge of doing that sort of authentication and authorization, it seems to be all built into the design of the approach. And that's the way it is with blockchain too. In some ways, you've got smart contracts controlling that, and I think Ruben was talking about the consent model that has to be created. So in some ways, it's governed by rules.
Mm-hmm. In the case of Flanders, it'll be the government giving them out, and that is very much like government mailboxes for other jurisdictions that have a lot of digital interoperability with the citizen.
Right, that makes sense, because identity typically comes from a community that you belong to. The government is an obvious community or community controller. It's the government that issues the social security number. If you have a bank account, then you are part of, if you like, the community of the bank, and they issue you with credentials that let you get to your bank account. But it's very easy to sort of say, well, it's going to be in the system, but the penalties for leaving holes somewhere are so great that I think you really need to get to the bottom of what is the authorization coming from. And I think it fundamentally has to come from a community of some kind.
In Belgium, it's actually arranged in a sort of hybrid way, in the sense that we used to use hardware to insert our ID card through USB, but that was a nightmare for most people. It never functioned, and at some point it was introduced. It's Me. I'll put the link, which is a collaboration between the biggest Belgian banks and telco providers, because you can only open a bank account if you have identified yourself by your ID card at the bank. And the same for telcos, because in Belgium you cannot, since a few years, you cannot anonymously have a SIM card anymore. So they know that it's one-on-one linked to a register or an authoritative source. And in that sense, you make your It's Me account by referring to one of your banks or one of your telco providers. And from that point onwards, it's your direct entry point into government systems.
Right. They have in fact a similar system, a bit like that in the UK, where it was called Verify, I think, where in order to access certain government services, you went through an identity provider, which used to be able to be your bank, but it wasn't taken up enough, and the banks all seem to have withdrawn from the scheme. So now it's got to be the post office or some other company. But if you like, the basis of that is getting identification from various sources, which could be driving license, could be a passport. And sort of pooling them in a in some combination, and then the identity provider company takes responsibility for saying, yes, we've looked at the evidence and this is you. But it's kind of it doesn't sound a very satisfactory system altogether in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, this is where in India with the Aadhaar system, it means that you don't need to have a physical home in order to access banking and insurance and social security services. There are still gaps. There are still people who are too poor and haven't been able to get an Aadhaar account who can't get social security, but for most people it's kind of okay. So what it means is
right. I think in India, don't they have a much more the government takes a stronger role and says you've got to trust us, which probably the European or the US wouldn't be able to quite take that position.
Well, and the Aadhaar system has also been responsible for. I mean, there have been huge breaches in India, as I understand it. Over 1 billion identities breached.
Yeah, but this is different to. I mean, what I'm saying is that they have this business of biometric IDs, and it does open up so many things. But what they also need to have is this business about not centralizing things and allowing people to retain in their own pods. So they've kind of got caught out by the timing of things and the availability of these personal knowledge stores. But the general idea of a government providing the infrastructure for a digital life is I think, part of one of the ways in which the rights of citizens can get fulfilled, in a universal way, if we're moving to a world where digital access is a human right.
Right, but I mean, maybe some governments are more trustworthy than others.
Absolutely. and that's why Germany is particularly cautious about who controls what. And it's an important debate that we need to have.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I should be worried about my Nigerian identity. Anyway, Ruben, that wasn't the question I was going to ask. So, Ruben, you mentioned token engineering, which is a term I'm not familiar with, but I especially wanted to know, how is it a blueprint, if you will, for the synthesis of top-down and bottom-up innovation?
Again, here I have to admit that I'm in no way authorized to claim expertise in this domain, but I've been following the discussions and they're mainly coming from Berlin, where there's an active Ethereum community. And I'm reading this book. It's not here right now, but it's called I'll take it 1 second. It's called Token Economy by Shermin Voskmir. So if you look up her name, I think you'll find a lot of resources. She has open sourced a book on GitHub, and in her talks she actually explained how the two parts, bottom up and top down, are actually linked. But it's basically because you incorporate economy or economic incentives into the equation. And that's where the governance aspect of traditional companies is very different from decentralized organizations that can mint their own coins, because you get a stake into the story, right? And I think that's where the semantic tragedy of the commons, that everybody would benefit from having a common data model that is extensible, and the whole idea behind data-centric architecture. It's pretty clear, but how can you incentivize people or companies, individuals or groups to work towards that goal? If you engineer the token correctly, it could be achievable. So maybe it's something to think about in the future. To think about a token that can not only serve as digital gold, as Bitcoin or a world computer or whatever, but can work towards a sort of semantic interoperability goal, and towards defining or drafting a common data model for organizations to work around. And I think that's where you would not need a top-down authoritative government or I don't know what to actually enforce it. And you would also not risk that divergent or separate and fragmented bottom-up initiatives remain fragmented. Because you can create an economic incentive to work towards that goal.
And what was the author's name?
Shermin Voskmer. So I'll post the
thank you.
The link. Yeah.
Ruben, what kind of economic incentives are we talking about? By the act of participating itself, by securing your all economic transactions itself is an incentive, I thought. But what else?
I think the network or the incentive you get by buying or providing liquidity to a system like Bitcoin is that you get a very secure, tamper-proof, censorship resistant, etc., chain of or a ledger, which can serve as a payment system, for example. So you provide liquidity or you mine and you provide energy to the system, but you get value from it in the sense that it can protect you against inflation at this point or whatever. The same would be applying here, I think, and I haven't thought about it deeply enough. But
if we want to break the stranglehold that the Googles of the world have on our data, we have to have a way to provide it to the people who are buying it from Google cheaper and better than I'll sell you access to me, and don't bother pop-up ads and all that crap. Just send me the note and give me $10 and I'll take it. You could imagine that, might work. If you could just disintermediate Google,
So you want to get rich instead of Google. You're making Google rich.
I want to cut them out.
No, I think, Dave, that's that's a huge question here, is like, who will be the entity that provides something that looks like the kind of integrated experience that Google and Facebook and Netflix, provide. Does anybody know any examples or promising initiatives in that regard?
I don't.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I've been waiting for since I first learned about Solid, but still waiting. So.
But to replicate the same services and catch up on the maturity that these kind of companies have is I think it's too big of a challenge, right? But there's a recognition now that even the blockchain or the Ethereum projects currently rely heavily on cloud services by the big tech companies. So there's Definity, which has launched their internet computer token, which has as the aim to develop an alternative system that's decentralized, but that can compete with the cloud services and the level of services that big tech can offer. But even there, I think they realize that the power they are facing is quite tremendous. And that if you
So if you were trying to advise a CEO who doesn't really want to know the details, but they want to do some planning and they've heard about decentralization, is it something we should invest some R&D money in over the next 3 years? What would you tell that person? Not just Ruben, but anybody on the call. I mean, would you say, yes, it's a good investment, or better to spend your money elsewhere for the next few years?
I guess it depends on how you define decentralization, right? Because if the aim is to provide an alternative to their existing structure, then there's no way in convincing a centrally organized company that they will be better off, because their vested interest is against decentralization by default, I guess.
Perhaps the tech sector companies would see it as a hedge, at least.
I don't know. So Chris, is your hand up again, or is that your old hand? Now you're muted.
Too many things to click all at once.
Yeah.
It depends on what the company's business model is. I would be inclined to suggest starting with an information provider who has a vested interest in selling their information, and therefore of being part of a decentralized information provision system where they're one of the providers. That's the sort of that I would suggest.
I also, in addition to that, it also depends on the maturity of participants' involvement and acceptance, right?
Yep.
If that is not there, then there's no game.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, we certainly turned over a lot of rocks today, so I appreciate everybody's participating. It was a good session today. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, for pulling that rabbit out of the hat there.
And we'll look forward to more notice next time for what we're going to be talking about.
Did we hit the end of our time? Is that what happened?